Hi, everyone. Welcome to the research tune-up with the Office of Research Services and Office of Partnerships and Innovation. Thank you so much for coming. This is the first session, and I really hope you'll join us for some of the other ones. I think there's going to be incredibly helpful tips for researchers. We've got different sessions around. There's a couple more around ethics, and the new Converse applications are offered on multiple dates. We have talks coming up on grants and specific grant applications. So it's really useful if you're thinking of applying. We are going to have some of our contracts folks also doing presentations. So please join, because I think these sessions will be quite helpful for seasoned researchers and new researchers coming on the scene. We're going to get started so that we can get through the material. My name is Rashmi Pandya. Everyone calls me Gogo, and I work in compliance and with human research in particular. There are different areas in compliance. There's animal research, but I'm not going to cover that today. I'll focus on the human research. And I do have a fellow compliance specialist that I work with, Era Steininger. I think probably quite a few of you are familiar with her. She's been here for a long time. Sorry about that. No problem getting it to go up and down. So what we're going to talk about today, we are going to just go over, a brief introduction to research ethics, particularly human research ethics. Some of the broad themes we're going to go through, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time because I think it's incredibly important to understand the context for why Research Ethics Board review is mandatory at most institutions. I'm going to go through some of the history and context in broad strokes with some key examples. And then we're going to discuss research guidelines, regulations, and policies, but more in relation to the Research Ethics Board review process at the U of R. And hopefully we can give you some tips just when working on your applications that will speed things up. Some of you may not see the humor, especially if you've gone through the REB review. You may not see the humor in this comic, but I'm hoping by the end that you will, and that you'll think it is funny and not just, yep, that's exactly what a Research Ethics Board does. So I want to start off with a key sort of pivotal shift in the thinking about the importance of research ethics review of research with human beings in North America. And it had reverberations all over the world, but it's a study that many people are probably familiar with, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis. And particularly the target population was Black American men from Alabama, Tuskegee, Alabama, and particularly Mason County. Which, economically was an incredibly disenfranchised area. So in 1932, the standard treatments for syphilis are toxic and dangerous. So, I've mentioned a few there. When the study initially starts, the aim of the study is to see if it would be better not to treat patients for syphilis, but rather develop treatments for each particular stage of the disease. So there's some, positive reasons why the researchers wanted to do what they started to do. And particularly as the treatments were themselves incredibly dangerous. So that aim initially ends up changing very quickly. So the doctors recruited 399 African-American men thought to have syphilis, and also they recruited a control group of 201 healthy African-American men. So it's quite a big sample size. The patients did not give any kind of informed consent. And in fact, they were deceived. They were told that the disease that they had was something called bad blood. And in 1947, so the study starts in 1932, it continues on. In 1947, penicillin becomes the standard cure for syphilis, right? And a really simple treatment. Tuskegee scientists withheld this information about penicillin from patients. And in fact, they went to various medical practitioners, medical institutions, gave them a list of the participants and asked that they not be treated for the syphilis if they came in. So at the aim of the study early on had become to see how the disease spreads and essentially kills patients. The irony here is in 1928, there was a study from Oslo called the Oslo study that had already charted the progression of the disease in several hundred white males. It was a retrospective chart review. So essentially this means they're looking back at the data and seeing how it progressed and eventually kills the individuals. So there was already data that sort of looked at what they were trying to find at this point. At the time, just so that you're not thinking these were mad scientists and incredibly crazy people, they really thought they were going to do some really good research here. There was, because there was sort of what we now know are sort of flawed conceptions of the differences, between different peoples. They really thought that there would be a difference in how the disease manifests in African American males as opposed to white males, right? So it was thought that in a predominantly white population, there's a tendency to develop more neurological problems, whereas they sort of hypothesized that with the African American population, it might be more cardiovascular diseases. So the justification from for the experiment, since there was nothing effectual that could be done about the disease, and I'm using this term throughout talking about this study because this is exactly what the researchers at the time, when it finally sort of all came out in the open, this is the term they used in a very derogatory sense, and it's not one we use in Canada for research participants, but they thought that subjects would be contributing to the benefit of humankind by their participation in this study. So, the patients were actually also coerced into participation. These were incredibly, as I said, economically disenfranchised people. They didn't have access to healthcare, and healthcare, you have to pay for it. So they were promised free healthcare, free burial eventually, and they were given meals, right? And the free treatments they received were things like spinal taps, which are incredibly painful, to provide, test results for the study itself, right? So they were deceived about what they were actually getting even. What's really horrifying about this study is the agencies that were involved were government agencies that should have been protecting, these citizens' rights. So the U.S. Public Health Services, which later becomes, during this study, the Center for Disease Control, was a key player in keeping the trial going for all the years it did. And, as one of the key authors writing about the case, once it sort of all hit the media through a whistleblower coming forward and reporting it in 1972, one of the sort of important things to remember is that, and I believe he was the director of the Public Health Services initially, and like one of the key players throughout this research study. One of the things he had responded to when asked how he could possibly have let this go on for so long, he said, the men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients, clinical material, not sick people. For the most part, civil servants simply did their jobs, another quote by Heller. Some merely followed orders. Others worked for the glory of science. And this should be reminiscent for anyone who's done a little bit of historical sort of looking into what some of the key figures in some of the atrocities that the Nazis committed was, right? This was an excuse that was given over and over again. We were just doing our jobs, right? Oh, sorry. So just to and I won't, I know that was quite long-winded, but I think it's an important, very important case because it did sort of say we need to have regulation in relation to research going on. You know, cases that are a little bit more difficult because of sort of what results come out of the kind of research that people were doing are cases like Henrietta Lacks. And if anyone doesn't know who this is, she was a cancer patient at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. As a course of her treatment, they had collected samples, and then without her consent, they had used some of her samples to create the HeLa cell line. This is still being used for cancer, so it's a live cancer cell line. It's still being used for cancer research to this day. The university, Johns Hopkins University, has profited from the unauthorized use of Mrs. Lack's biological sample. There was no consent. The family certainly never gave any kind of consent, and they've certainly never profited from any of that. And they didn't know it was happening, that it had actually happened even. There's also, and I bring this up as well in the examples we've used, because, you know, if we look at sort of research, particularly with Indigenous populations in North America, and particularly nowadays where we've got tissue and genetic banking going on and all kinds of testing that can give us all kinds of information through genetic analysis, even a small thing like a blood sample becomes something that can be abused in a huge way. And I'm going to mispronounce both of these tribes incredibly badly, but you know, two examples are the Havasupai people in Arizona, and I think I have the spelling wrong. Very apologies to this First Nations group, as it should be NUU. The new Chinook First Nations in BC. So briefly, you know, the Havasupai invited the researchers from Arizona State University to study the high rate of diabetes in their people. The researchers used the samples to study tribal schizophrenia, population genetics, and you know, if you look at some of the literature on this, it's even more horrifying how this was framed, because it's in terms of inbreeding and migration patterns. In the case of the Nuchadil, they had asked a University of British Columbia researcher to study a genetic basis of arthritis and related diseases in their community. The researchers shared the samples for research on HIV and AIDS, population genetics, and evolutionary history. Some of this research is incredibly stigmatizing of this First Nations people, and essentially he sort of shared it amongst other researchers, and something like 200 articles have come out of this that are in print and out there. So incredibly damaging. And I realize most of these are examples that are biomedical, that, you know, we don't have to look too far to see some behavioral ones that come out of universities that are not biomedical. There's you know, a lot of attention been given to the Stanford prison experiments, you know, Stanley Milbrook's authoritarian experiments, and some of the ethical issues that arose with both of those. But, you know, closer to home, we also have the residential school nutrition experiments. And there's a lot of similarity here in the type of departments that were involved in this, because these are key government players, right? So the Department of Indian Affairs, in partnership with a well-known pediatric researcher from the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, carried out clinical trials on First Nations and Métis children in residential schools. There was no consent. Parents were not told the children were in experiments. And what's more insidious here is these experiments were taking place because there was a real issue of malnutrition in the residential schools. So, you know, they essentially did things like had control and treatment groups of malnourished children. And the treatment groups were quite often denied adequate nutrition, as sometimes so were the control groups, because there was an issue with malnutrition. In one study, children were given a flour mix containing added thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and bone meal. Rather than improving nutrition, the children became more anemic, and likely this contributed to more deaths, and it certainly impacted their development. So, having sort of gone through a history of why we're doing this and why ethics review is so essential, you know, and particularly it's essential in the sense that it should be part of any good research design, right? If your research is not ethically sound, you probably don't have a sound research design. But if, you know, if a researcher is even thinking purely from a self-interested perspective, more and more, and not just scientific journals, the journals, period, will not actually publish if they think that there's serious issues with the ethics of a research project, right? And certainly famous, you know, there's a famous, probably still the most renowned biomedical journal, The Lancet. They published a really flawed study that they kept in their running in publication for 12 years that essentially suggested a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism and colitis, which has caused, you know, it caused substantial damage. And I think the last few years of the pandemic should probably bring home how damaging that can be. But, you know, importantly, also just from a really self-interested financial perspective, for the University of Regina to hold Tri-Council funding, so this is CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC funding, you know, we need to guarantee that there's going to be oversight, ethical oversight of research, and we also need to assure that our researchers will conduct research in an ethical manner. So the condition of our holding that funding is that the research under our auspices be ethical, right? So it's you know, even just from those perspectives, it's incredibly important. So to go into the sort of key guideline that we at ethics boards follows, we're really not making stuff up. We're going from the guidelines we're mandated to follow in Canada. And this is the Tri-Council policy statement for ethical conduct for research involving humans. And for short, we say TCPS2. There's a new version, by the way, 2022, with some important changes, particularly keeping in line with, you know, they've been introduced a section on broad consent, which is very important because the Tri-Council has changed some of its requirements in terms of data availability. So you know, they actually are requiring that there be some sort of open source access to research data so that studies aren't being replicated unnecessarily, and that the data is usable by others as well. And there's three key principles that are going to run through all of the guidelines, and that you know, we're always going to kind of be coming back to in any kind of ethical review. And these are respect for persons. And what this entails is, you know, a respect for the individual autonomy of a person. We are going to really spend a lot of time on any kind of consent forms, because you know, we need to be sure that the consent is truly informed. And obviously from examples like Tuskegee, you can see what happens when it's not, right? Voluntary participation, and this is really important because part of voluntary participation is participants can withdraw from a study at any time, and they can request that their data be withdrawn. And that should be part and parcel of any consent form. And, you know, a key sort of player, and particularly nowadays as we move into a more and more sort of digital world with this. Or we might really already be there and I'm just old school and just getting there, I don't know. But you know, the privacy and confidentiality, and we're going to spend a lot of time, you know, you'll notice that's usually where you get a lot of your comments back from in ethical reviews. So it's an important section to get right the first time around, right? Concern for welfare of participants. We're going to be looking at things like, you know, when we read applications, physical, mental, and spiritual well-being of individuals, their physical, social, and economic well-being, the quality of the person's experiences. So we want to be sure that any research endeavors, you know, are really assessing risks to the well-being of individuals. Justice, and this is a key one, and certainly was, you know, I think overtly evident in all three, you know, all four of the examples I used. You know, obviously, one of the key things of the principle of justice is fairness and equity. You know, too often, sort of key research that had sort of real positive impact has predominantly focused on white males. And, you know, this is interesting because the huge impact this has had on things like cardiovascular health for women, for example, because the way, you know, cardiovascular diseases impact women it's not the same. So the treatment options can't be the same, but all of the studies, all of the clinical trials were on men, right? So we don't have that kind of data, and this is now something that people are rushing to fix up, right? So sort of unfair exclusion, and predominantly, let's be honest as well, a lot of those important trials where the outcomes were going to really impact health in a positive way, or impact people in a positive way in other areas. There were exclusions then, right? There were certain people that were not included in that research. And this is also evident from, you know, what we see happening today, right? In terms of the long-term effects of that kind of exclusion of different groups. So we really look at that notion. We want to see who your, you know, what your inclusion criteria is. Have you thought of all of this? Are you unfairly excluding participants? Are you clear on what your inclusion criteria are, right? Important elements in any good, you know, study design. So just to give you a definition, because I think sometimes there's a confusion between whether something's research or not. And I've had this question come up quite a bit. I thought it was more relevant to sort of a healthcare context, but it's come up here in different cases. So I thought it was good to go through it. Research is defined by TCPS2 as an undertaking intended to extend knowledge through a disciplined inquiry or systematic investigation. This is important to keep in mind because, you know, particularly if you're, a lot of our researchers are creating, for example, like mental health care treatment options, right? Or they're creating, you know, educational components that are actually going to be put into curriculums and things like that. So quite often there can be confusion as to whether you're evaluating, when you're evaluating those things, whether that would actually fall under what TCPS2 does not consider research, which is program evaluation, quality improvement, quality assurance initiatives. But it's important to remember the purpose, because when those are used exclusively for assessment, management, or improvement purposes of usually a particular institution, those are exempt from our EB review. I recommend at least running the idea by the compliance folks, just so that you're sure about this, so you don't go ahead with something because we can't review retroactively. So just ask if you're not sure. It's very important to note, and we get a lot of questions about this, that course-based research activities are considered research that require review under TCPS2. And also under U of R research policies, these can be reviewed by an approved department ethics committee. There are some conditions around that, like we need a proposal to be run by us, and it has to have a plan of action for how that review is going to take place. But also we do need like an annual reporting of what you've approved and what's gone through that process. These are very important, and I sort of went through those, good doing this because it was a refresher for me as well. Research not requiring ethics review is publicly available through a mechanism set out by legislation or regulation that's protected by law. So, a lot of people use research that's publicly available through StatsCan or, FAC or some of these different organizations, right? If it's publicly available, it doesn't need to go through IB review, right? Because you're using data that's already out there. One that's a key player, and we're actually getting a new research institute that's going to be focusing on this. Research that's out there in the public domain, and the individuals to whom the information refers have no reasonable expectation of privacy. So pretty well anything you're looking at on the internet that's publicly available like that falls under that rubric, right? Research that involves observation of people in public places. And I had such an interesting discussion with somebody from Panama, one of our researchers, on this, because he said, can I do this? And I was like, I'm going to get back to you. I don't know if you can do that. But research involving observation of people in public places and does not involve any kind of intervention. So this is key, right? You're just watching, you're not interacting, you're not going to like go and have a conversation and do an informal interview or something, right? That this doesn't involve any kind of intervention, right? Staged by the researcher. And that those being observed have no reasonable expectation of privacy. Also, any dissemination of the research results do not allow for identification of specific individuals. Another interesting one is creative practices. I've had this question from a friend actually that works here. In and of themselves, they don't require REB review. However, research that employs creative practice to obtain responses from participants that will be analyzed to answer a research question is subject to REB review. So it's important to keep in mind, because we had actually a really interesting student project that was going to use, it was a theater piece, and they were going to use the audience interaction as part of their research piece for their thesis. So that would, you need to get REB approval for that, okay? So the following require research ethics review and approval by an REB before the research can commence. And just so everyone knows, most of this is from TCPS2. I'm not making it up. Research involving living human participants, research involving human biological materials, as well as human embryos, fetuses, fetal tissue, reproductive materials, and stem cells. It's also applicable, very interestingly, to materials derived from living and dead, deceased individuals. I found out that there's like all these archives of medical records in Saskatchewan that the Saskatchewan Archives has. But it's interesting to know how far back HIPAA goes, right? So it does fall under the rubric of REB review. Research utilizing any kind of retrospective or prospective personal health data needs to go through REB review. So, it's important to kind of know how TCPS2 sort of characterizes the risk level in research. And it's interesting to note they do not have a definition of above minimal risk. So you sort of have to conjecture that what's above minimal risk from what is minimal risk. And minimal risk is defined as research in which the probability and magnitude of possible harms implied by participation in the research is no greater than those encountered by participants in those aspects of their everyday life that relate to the research. So if we sort of try to think of what above minimal risk research would entail, we could say that above minimal risk research studies would entail that the probability and magnitude of possible harms implied by participation in research is greater than those encountered by participants in those same aspects related to the research of their daily lives that relate to the research. I would say another factor that comes into play in sort of that assessment of above minimal risk is the vulnerability of participant pools, capacity to consent, things like that. So how does an ethics board come, what is it we actually do when we're making an assessment? Well, we do something called a proportionate review, and people refer to it in terms of different philosophical ethical theories as utilitarianism, which there's definitely kind of assessing harms or risks and harms and benefits and sort of weighing those. Consequentialism. One of my favorites that I kind of like, because it also sort of entails looking at principles and sort of assessing between different principles, is a theory called ethical pluralism by a philosopher named W.B. Ross. And essentially what you would be doing is you'd be looking at beneficence, the principles, the ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence. And essentially you would be trying to minimize harm and maximize benefit in whatever it is you're undertaking. So what an REB does is a kind of an assessment and balance of the real and potential risks, harms, and benefits. And I know this sometimes is like, it looks like we're grasping at straws sometimes when we are talking about potential risks, but we will ask you to address even the potential risks, right? Even if the possibility of them is fairly low, if it's a risk at all, even at a small percentage point of possibility, we need you to address it. Okay, so we have a new Converse system, and I confess it's going to be probably just a few weeks before we are really seeing the impact of that time-wise, just because we had a very busy late November and December, so we're still kind of catching up. But it's going to simplify, hopefully, and speed up the whole REB review process. We have now 4 applications: the standard application form, which is essentially rolled into one, the behavioral and biomedical applications. There were 2 separate applications initially. And the key areas in this, they're much more detailed. So if you are filling in the application and addressing each of the elements, you should be, there should be significantly fewer comments coming back or changes requested, right? Because it'll ask you to specify how you're doing certain things. And with the old application forms, people could miss giving the details of that. So the areas, that you really want to think about, particularly in application forms that the REB is going to look at, is, your recruitment methods. We want to see all the documentation in relation to that, right? So if you're sending out, you're asking an institution, for example, to send out emails for you, we want that email. We want anything that's participant facing, right? All the recruitment posters, social media posts. The consent form, we have templates that are available to you on our website. Please look at those and the guidance notes for those, because it really provides, and we also have guidance on things like using Zoom and how to sort of even wording for things like the requirements for particularly those people that have research accounts and need to have some sort of reporting information about like honorariums provided to participants. We have a financial, a guidance form on what finance requires in that regard, and things you can put into the consent form to make sure that participants know that you're collecting that data for those purposes. Data security is really key. Please be sure that you are really thinking about how you're going to keep your data secure for the full life cycle of the research. Secondary use of data form is a much simpler form, because usually this is accessing, for the most part, anonymous research. But please note, and I've noticed this a few times, if there's identifiers at all, just that you are taking out the identifier for the final data set, this is not anonymous, right? As long as you have that list that has the identifiers, at best your data is de-identified when you strip the data set, right, of the identifiers. So you should look. TCPS2 has some nice definitions on those, so take a look so that you're not using the wrong terminology throughout. The course-based research form is very straightforward, I think. From what I've seen, for the most part, it's usually things like surveys. And they're usually like things like in-class surveys, or it'll be like with a very limited pool of and controlled pool of participants or something. It's good to submit the template for that if you're going to submit to us. We're going to be looking to be sure that the students understand the ethical requirements and also the requirements for privacy and confidentiality, even in those kinds of projects that are really just to teach students about research. So please just be mindful that you are addressing all of that in that close-based research form. It's a pretty straightforward form, like probably if you've thought of the research, the assignment, you've already thought of most of the things anyway. Super easy process now, which, it sort of was the process before, but it's, I think, even simpler online now. The approved by another institution form. Please, one of the things that does slow things down, make sure you submit all of the relevant documents that were approved at the other institution. We need those consent forms. We need the recruitment material. We need the surveys or interview guides, etc. Right? So submit everything that was approved at the other institution, including the other institution's approval. And essentially, it really simplifies. And TCPS 2 has just gone to recommending single board review for minimal risk studies. So, it should really simplify the process for our researchers here, because you just need that other institution's review information all submitted with the study information, and it should be straightforward. Thank you. Okay, so what is the review process? Because I do notice that this is something that comes up a lot. Particularly maybe because they've been talking to me, so I don't know if people think I'm like an integral part of that process, but no, alas, I am not, other than at the beginning. So I'm going to go through it in clear, in a clear way, I hope, and then hopefully people will understand. So we kind of have two levels of review. For minimal risk studies, we would do something called a delegated review, and the compliance specialist would be involved in that to a certain extent. So usually it'll go through what's called a delegated review process, and I'll show you the two different possibilities for that in a minute. And what's called a notice of ethical review, and I'm going to be referring to that as the NER, will be, it'll be issued to the researchers afterwards, and it'll request revisions or clarifications, or, rarely, but usually people who have gone through the process a bit kind of know how to do all that stuff. We have seen a few come through where it's like, this is fabulous, approved, right? So, or you'll get the approval letter, okay? Minimal risk studies can be submitted to the REB at any time. There's no deadlines for submission. Above minimal risk studies, on the other hand, are reviewed at monthly board meetings. Currently, we don't have like a set of dates for meetings. We usually try to just book as soon as we see we've got studies that need to be reviewed. Andrea and I, who's here with us today, you can't see her, but she is, will be discussing that, because maybe we should have set dates so people can put it in their calendar and things like that, the board members, and so researchers know. So I want to just give you a bit of a process flow. I'm not super great at doing these, so I hope this is not just confusing and it's like, what are all these errors, right? But essentially, you submit your application. The first stage of review is that compliance review, and what we're reviewing for is completeness and the level of risk. That's something that the researcher assesses, but usually we'll go through the documentation and make sure that that level of risk is appropriately documented by the researcher, and it's the right level of risk. So if it's what we call the lowest, we've created a new category called the lowest risk, because it was taking a while for projects to go through. And what we mean by this is usually anonymous surveys, right? There's very little risk to participants entailed in this. That only goes through a review. So I will contribute to the comments that would go on the notice of ethical review, and then it goes directly to one of our two co-chairs, and then they review, and then either an NER is issued or an approval. When it's minimal risk studies that entail a bit more intervention, so it's like interviews or focus groups or some sort of intervention, even if it's not deemed to be above minimal risk, but it's a bit more of a complex protocol. This goes through a different form of delegated review, and essentially it goes to two ethics board members, and these members are randomly assigned. We have about, I believe about 20 board members currently. So they'll be assigned so that the same people aren't sort of getting 5 studies at once or something. So occasionally I will flag that I would like somebody specific on it if there's something very detailed for a particular area that I think we need expertise in the review on. When the ethics board's members have finished their reviews, the chair is notified, and the chair does a final review, collates all the comments, adds their own comments, and then a notice of ethical review is issued. And usually this just asks for a resubmission addressing the comments, and then that process usually just takes place between the chair and the researchers. Okay, and you're going to be really tired of my process maps in a minute. There's also the delegated review for course space and approved at another institution applications, and this is obviously from the 2 little captions there, it's very simple. Comes to the compliance specialist who reviews the applications, issues the NER or approves, and obviously the same process. Researcher receives the NER, resubmits, so the study is approved and can proceed. Then the full board reviews are a little bit more complex, and I wanted people to understand sort of what the possibilities of the decisions at full board are. So the compliance specialist still does the intake. We review, we assess for completeness. We assess, is this above minimal risk indeed? So there's been a few since I've been here where I said, no, I don't really think it needs to go full board. So it doesn't, but it's not random. You saw from earlier, there's guidelines, right? So if it is full board, it goes to the full board. And the full board reviews at a monthly meeting. And by full board, I mean everyone. So the chair is there, or chairs now, because we have 2, and as many of the board members as we can get, just to assure we have quorum. And all of the members contribute to that notice of ethical review. So all the board members will submit comments, or the minutes will document the comments, and the chair still at the chair level, she'll put it all, both our chairs currently are she's, but to be politically correct, we'll just say the chair. They sort of compile everything and put it together. So there's kind of 3 possibilities on what the board usually would decide on after they've voted. And so they would say something like provisional approval with changes to the chair. So this is usually that there's some minor changes and things that need, the board would like to see clarified, etc. And those then would just go back to the chair, and that would be between the researcher and the chair. They would work together to get those documents in order so that they can be approved. In rare cases where maybe a study really needs some significant changes and the board feels the changes are significant enough that it really needs to come back to the whole board, they can ask for provisional approval with changes back to full board. I haven't seen that very often, but it can happen. And rarely would the board say, oh my goodness, fabulous. And particularly at the full board level, right? You've got 20 people or whatever reviewing something, somebody's going to find something that was missed. Okay. Continuing review, which is really essential. If you're making any kind of changes to approved studies, even minor things like adding a question to a survey, you need to submit that via an amendment to the compliance specialist. Unfortunately, this is not a system. We don't have this in Converis, so we're still following the old system. So please, if you look on the ethics forms page on the website, right at the bottom, there's an amendment form. So please, note that you still need to follow that process and send it to the research ethics inbox. But that review just goes on at the compliance specialist level, and it's the same for annual renewals. And please, like one of the good things, fill in those applications thoroughly so that there's not questions or anything and you can get them processed quicker. Sometimes with amendments, if you really are changing something significantly from what was initially approved, it may go to, it may have to go to the chair or something for consultation. Am I way behind? Oh my goodness, I am a chatty baloo. I'm gonna have to go quick now. Okay. Please just remember and some of the key things you want to make sure, especially like I said, Tri-Council has changed some of its its requirements in terms of disseminating findings, right? Like it's really important that you are sharing findings with participants. And also from the examples I used, please keep in mind public trust is critical, trust in the institution, in the investigator, in the researcher process, in the research process itself. And bad research can really impact that. Informed consent, key. It has to be obtained before research begins. It has to be maintained throughout. Please note, because I think a lot of people are under the misconception that consent is a contract that the participant signs. The participant is not obligated to anything that's in a consent form. The researcher is obligated to only conduct the research as it's stated in the informed consent form. He's obligated, they are obligated to the research ethics board to do that, right? Please make sure you're using relevant language. I quite often find that it sounds so academic and we usually suggest even, if it's like a student body or something, because research can be quite specific, use like a grade 6 to 8 reading level. Explain clearly what you are doing, right? Use culturally appropriate language. Recruitment shouldn't be coercive or without undue influence. And I know we don't have much time here, but has anybody else been hounded by Stats Canada to do a survey? I had this whole conversation yesterday because I was so busy. And I said, look, this is the 20th time you've phoned me. You've sent me 5 things. Is this not meant? Like you told me that this is voluntary. Yes, but we will just keep calling you. Even if you tell us you don't want to do it, we'll phone you back. I said, well, that is not voluntary. That's coercive. So don't do that. Okay. Make sure that you give participants adequate time to consider participation. Please make sure that the consent form is really an informed consent form. Go through all of the procedures and processes and make sure that people understand exactly what those are. It must be voluntary. If for any reason during any of the research process, even if they've consented, they want to withdraw, they should be able to, right? And this should be in your application so that we're not coming back and saying, how are you going to account for, are you going to be what are the conditions under which they can withdraw? It's legitimate to say we need to keep the data up to a certain point for the integrity of the study, but that has to be in the consent form. Okay. Please note that, and this is something I said in relation to above minimal risk studies. Please note that marginalized groups or populations, that have been underrepresented in research would be considered vulnerable populations, and this is going to, in the estimation of the Research Ethics Board, increase the risk level of your study. So traditionally this has been women, BIPOC populations that have either been underrepresented or in the examples I used today, represented in a way that is, incredibly negative and certainly not beneficial to the communities themselves. So, please make sure that you are really considering whether your research is dealing with one of, these, and there may be others that I've not included in here, but, I would include students in here, right? If you are doing research with your students, you're already at they're at a vulnerable vulnerable relationship with you because, and with any faculty member, not necessarily just their professor, right? That there's a power differential there. So keep that in mind. Capacity, which I think, quite often with the studies I've seen is not a thing, but, it's important to remember, consider whether the people can consent at the time that they are doing so. There can be different times in people's lives where the complexity of the choice that you're asking them to make, they're not capable of doing. So, you should have a way of assessing for that. Circumstances surrounding the decision could be difficult. So just keep in mind that that's something that researchers should be thinking of. With the behavioral research ethics application, if it's just all under that standard application, but there's some key things you should keep in mind. Recruitment method, make sure that's really worked out. How are participants determined for your project? What's the inclusion criteria? Can you provide a rationale for that inclusion criteria? Make sure you submit all the recruitment material. Make sure the consent process is very tight, right? And this is very important. I hear, and I know it's coming out of a place sometimes of a little bit of frustration with just the process. But if I hear one more time that qualitative research, doesn't have to have the kind of rigor and that they, researchers feel it's being compared to quantitative research or scientific research. Even qualitative research needs to be worked out, have the details worked out, because otherwise you are not, that is going to impact the kind of data you're going to be able to pull out, right? But also to protect yourself. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong if you don't have things worked out prior to conducting a study, right? I think we can go ahead. I think that was some key ones. I did just want to say there is a whole section here. This will be available online. There is a whole section on just sort of what to do and what not to do, just some recommendations. And this is something that's easily readable. You don't need somebody going through it, and some of the just considerations with data privacy, protecting data privacy, security. So please do look at the end of this. I'm sorry I was so verbose. And thank you very much for joining us today. And if you do sort of want some insider hints from, the chairs, they will be joining us next week for a session with both the chairs. We will be starting off with our newest chair from First Nations University, Dr. Cassandra Junta. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I never know to say the J softly or not. And we will be also having a session with our, chair who's been sort of in the position for quite a while, Dr. Kim Dorsch, and she's going to talk about the common comments on application forms that come back in MERs and sort of problematic areas. So really, it'll be a helpful session, both of those. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, please email me because we have no time, I think, do we? We have 3 minutes. Sure. No, I can. Okay. Should I say who it is or would people rather not? Okay. So there's a question from Amanda saying, thank you for offering the presentation. Oh, you're welcome. I'm new faculty at the U of R. I have a number of active research projects that have been previously approved by my previous university. What is involved and where do I start to get approval for those projects in place at the U of R? So I think what we have been doing is essentially we're letting you carry over the initial approval, particularly now with single board reviews for minimal risk. So if they are minimal, Amanda, I think we could probably let you just transfer that approval over. So we'd get you to open a file and it would be that application that's approved by another institution. But you should talk about moving the study over. It's not so much an ethics thing as it is you'd be working under the auspices of the U of R now. So I'm sure that even from the other institutions' perspective, they'd want you to transfer the research over. It's a simple process from what I understand. But, give me a call and we can discuss the details of it. How much time does it take in general to get ethics approval for a master's thesis? We've had a bit of a crazy busy November and December, and we had sort of a shortage of reviewers, and the chair was not able to get to review, so they were taking a little bit longer. What we're really hoping, and what I'm seeing with Converis, is that turnaround time should be super fast. It should be like, depending on the complexity of the thesis and what all you're doing in terms of participant interaction, it should be fairly fast. But I really would, and I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce your name right, Tanushree. I would really suggest come and see me. Let's have a sit down before you start working on that application, so that you're not sort of making errors that are going to end up taking a long time. So it's just good to come see me, and I can sort of make some recommendations on how to go about things. It depends. If the question is, do I need to submit an amendment for each time I add, change, revise a research question? Yeah, if it's changing your research design, you sure do. And I'm assuming that would impact things like consent. So, please consider what all you need to change. And if you can kind of get all the data in for the amendment all at once, like all the documents you need to make changes on, usually it's minor, you're adding something to consent forms and things. So, you do need to submit an amendment because we need to document that. That's it. Oh, we got to them all. Fabulous. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. And as I said, please try to join the other sessions. They'll be super useful for researchers at U of R. Thank you.